At 06:15 hours on August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood silently at the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal, the first light etching the outlines of his soldiers behind him. He stared across the sluggish water of Alligator Creek at the silent, dark outline of the American Marine positions. In his mind, there was no doubt. Behind him were 917 of Japan's finest, the vanguard of the 28th Infantry Regiment, men hardened by victory across China and Southeast Asia. They were the living embodiment of Yamato Damashi, the unparalleled spirit of Japan that had humbled the Russian Empire in 1905 and swept aside every Western army in Asia since Pearl Harbor. Ichiki knew what the intelligence reports from Tokyo said about the Americans on the other side. They were soft, undisciplined, individualistic. They were a consumer society soldiers, lacking the spiritual fortitude for true combat. They would break at the first determined Banzai charge, as all Westerners did. This wasn't just an attack, it was a destined correction of the global order, where ancient spirit would once again triumph over modern steel. This unshakable belief was not mere arrogance, it was the cornerstone of Imperial Japan's military doctrine. For decades, the officer corps had been taught that technological and numerical inferiority were irrelevant when faced with Japanese willpower. The victory over Tsarist Russia at Port Arthur and Mukden had been mythologized as a triumph of Seishin, spirit, over Bushitsu, material. Japanese soldiers were descendants of the gods, fighting for a divine emperor. American Marines, by contrast, were seen as a poorly trained colonial police force, their last real combat experience decades old in the trenches of World War I, now corrupted by peacetime comforts. Ichiki was so confident that upon landing days earlier, he deliberately ignored explicit orders to wait for his full regiment. He would not share the glory. As the sky lightened, he gave the order. His men fixed bayonets, their faces etched with serene certainty. They began their advance toward the creek, ready to administer a lesson. But the lesson that dawn would be taught not by Japan, but to Japan. The silent Marine line ahead was not held by the men of Japanese intelligence reports. It was held by the 1st Marine Division, and they had not come to Guadalcanal to run. The deafening silence that greeted Colonel Ichiki's advancing troops was a historical anomaly, a break in a pattern that had defined the first 6 months of the Pacific War. From the very first strikes on December 7, 1941, a tsunami of Japanese victories had swept across Asia and the Pacific, each triumph meticulously recorded and studied as proof of a fundamental truth. The fall of the impregnable British fortress at Singapore in February 1942 was the ultimate case study. There, a British and Commonwealth force of over 80,000 men surrendered to a Japanese army half its size. To Tokyo's high command, this was not just a military victory, it was a cultural and spiritual verdict. The images of endless columns of haggard European prisoners, heads bowed, confirmed everything they believed about Western decadence and lack of resolve. The same story played out in the Dutch East Indies, in Burma, and most pointedly in the Philippines. The much-vaunted American forces under General MacArthur collapsed with stunning speed. The protracted defense of the Bataan Peninsula and the final surrender of Corregidor in May 1942, resulting in the catastrophic death march of prisoners, was seen not as a testament to American endurance under impossible odds, but as the final, pitiful collapse of a soft society. The lesson was clear and universal. When faced with the transcendent will of the Japanese warrior, Western armies, for all their wealth and machines, would inevitably break. This doctrine of spiritual supremacy seemed infallible, and it directly shaped the view of the U.S. Marine Corps. Japanese intelligence assessments dismissed the Marines as a minor, under-equipped force, their experience limited to colonial banana wars against irregular fighters in Haiti and Nicaragua. Their stubborn defense of Wake Island in December 1941, which held out for 16 days against invasion, was filed away as a curious exception, a fluke made possible only because the garrison was surrounded by ocean with nowhere to run. The core assumption remained unchallenged. The American fighting man, and the Marine in particular, was psychologically unprepared for the sheer terror of close-quarters combat against an enemy who welcomed death. This belief was not abstract for Colonel Ichiki and his men. It was the tactical blueprint for their assault on Guadalcanal. Why wait for artillery or full regimental strength when the enemy's morale was his critical weakness? A single violent shock from a dedicated battalion would shatter the Marine perimeter. As Ichiki's first wave charged into the killing zone of Alligator Creek, they carried with them the absolute certainty born of 6 months of uninterrupted victory. They were about to discover that the greatest military danger is not misinformation, but a perfect understanding of a reality that no longer exists. The lesson of Wake Island was not an anomaly. It was the first chapter of a new, unread book. While Colonel Ichiki's confidence was built upon a myth of American weakness, the reality on the other side of Henderson Field was one of desperate improvisation. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division was not an elite force fresh from triumphant conquests. It was a hastily assembled unit, many of its men still raw recruits, scattered across the Pacific when orders for Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal, came down. Promised 6 months to train, they were given barely 3 weeks. Their rehearsal landing in Fiji was a fiasco, a chaotic mess of misplaced equipment and confused units that led one observer to deem the entire coming operation impossible. Yet on the morning of August 7, 1942, they stormed ashore onto Guadalcanal's beaches. To their shock, they met almost no resistance. The Japanese construction troops and small garrison fled into the jungle, abandoning the nearly completed airfield. By August 8th, the Marines had secured their prize, which they promptly christened Henderson Field. A profound, unsettling quiet settled on the island. The landing had been too easy, a sentiment that curdled into foreboding as the men dug shallow foxholes into the volcanic soil, their eyes scanning the dense, alien jungle. They had taken the island, but now, utterly exposed, they had to hold it. That foreboding turned to cold dread on the night of August 9th. Off the coast in the pitch-black waters of the Sound, a powerful Japanese cruiser force slipped undetected past Allied pickets. In a brutal, one-sided melee known as the Battle of Savo Island, they sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in less than an hour, killing over 1,000 sailors. It was one of the most crushing naval defeats in U.S. history. In response, the supporting American fleet, including the vital aircraft carriers and transport ships still laden with the Marine supplies, withdrew immediately to safer waters. The decision, though rational from a naval standpoint, left Vandegrift's men truly abandoned. Nearly half their food, ammunition, and heavy equipment sailed away with the retreating ships. Overnight, 11,000 Marines transformed from an invasion force into a stranded garrison, perched on a hostile island with only the weapons and rations they had managed to unload, surrounded by an enemy who controlled the sea and the night. The bitter sentiment among the Marines was captured in a later, unofficial medal. It depicted an admiral's hand dropping a hot potato into a Marine's arms. The message was clear. The Navy had passed them a disaster. Yet in that moment of supreme vulnerability, the very culture the Japanese dismissed began to show its strength. The Marines didn't panic. They rationed their food, finished the airfield using captured Japanese bulldozers, and began to subsist on seized stores of enemy rice. They were preparing not to be evacuated, but to fight for their lives. Fueled by the absolute certainty of his own superiority and the flawed intelligence from Rabaul, Colonel Ichiki acted with fatal haste. Landing at Taiyu Point on the night of August 19th, He was informed that American resistance was likely token, with perhaps only 2,000 demoralized defenders remaining. Aerial reconnaissance, seeing few Marines moving in the open and no large fleet, had drawn the catastrophic conclusion that the main force had already withdrawn. For Ichiki, this was not just an opportunity, it was an insult. To wait days for the rest of his regiment would be to share the glory of an easy victory. With contempt for both his orders and his enemy, he left a small rear guard and immediately pushed inland with roughly 800 men, ordering a punishing night march through the thick jungle toward the airfield. His plan was simple and brutal, a direct, overwhelming assault that would crush the Marine perimeter at its eastern anchor, a sandbar crossing at Alligator Creek. He was so sure of swift victory that before marching he burned his personal documents and the regiment's secret codes, a gesture not of despair but of anticipated triumph, signaling he would not need them before linking up with the fleet after retaking the field. His column moved with the noise of men who believed they were hunters, not the hunted. What Ichiki could not know was that his every move was about to collide with a different kind of spirit, one born not of mystical ideology, but of gritty preparation and a crucial warning. The Marine perimeter, though stretched thin, was a conscious defense in depth, with interlocking fields of fire, and the men at the creek were on high alert. That alert came from a man who defied all of Japan's assumptions about native loyalty and human endurance. A Melanesian scout and former police sergeant, Jacob Voza, had been captured by Ichiki's advance troops. Discovering an American flag hidden in his loincloth, they tortured him for information, bayoneting him repeatedly in the chest, arms, and throat before tying him to a tree and leaving him for dead. Voza chewed through his bonds and, despite horrific wounds, crawled for miles through the jungle to deliver his warning to the Marines. A strong Japanese force was approaching and would attack that very night. His incredible act of loyalty and fortitude gave the Marines their final precious minutes to fully man their positions. As Ichiki's lead company formed up in the dark, whispering final commands, the Marines across the sandbar waited in utter silence, fingers on triggers, grenades lined up, artillery pre-sighted. The trap, born of Japanese arrogance and sprung by Allied resilience, was set. The hunters had walked directly into the kill zone. The silence shattered at 01:30 a.m. on August 21st, not with a preparatory artillery barrage, but with a primal scream. The first wave of Ichiki soldiers burst from the coconut grove, firing from the hip and shouting Banzai as they charged across the exposed sandbar of Alligator Creek. They expected to see shadowy figures fleeing before them, as Western soldiers always did. Instead, they were met with a wall of light and steel. A single piercing flare turned night into ghostly day, and the killing ground was instantly illuminated. In that frozen second, the leading edge of the assault saw the stark outlines of Marine foxholes and the dark muzzles of heavy machine guns. Then, hell erupted. The Marines, disciplined and waiting, opened fire with a coordinated fury that tore the Japanese ranks apart. Water-cooled 30-caliber machine guns, pre-sighted to cover every inch of the approach, fired until their barrels steamed. Mortar rounds and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister shot, hundreds of steel balls scythed through the packed formations. The sandbar, a mere 20 yards wide, became a churning spectacle of carnage. Yet, driven by a culture that valued momentum over survival, successive waves pressed forward, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, only to be cut down in turn. The shock for the Japanese was not just the volume of fire, but its source. These were not panicking garrison troops. These were steady, professional infantrymen executing a perfect defense. The myth of spiritual invincibility met the reality of concentrated firepower and shattered on the spot. As the night wore on, the battle descended into pockets of surreal horror and raw courage. At one machine gun pit, Private John L. Al Schmid was blinded by the blast of a Japanese grenade. With shrapnel in his face and eyes destroyed, he refused to leave his post. Guided by his assistant gunner who shouted directions toward the sounds of enemy movement, Schmid continued to fire his weapon by touch alone, holding his sector until dawn. By first light, the attack had spent itself against the unyielding Marine line. Hundreds of Japanese dead and dying littered the sandbar in the creek mouth. But General Vandegrift was not content with a defensive victory. He ordered a flanking counterattack. Marine companies crossed the creek upstream and swept down behind Ichiki's shattered force, encircling the survivors in the coconut grove. Then came the final brutal punctuation. M3 Stuart's Might tanks, the Iron Cavalry, clanked onto the battlefield. They drove directly into the grove, machine guns chattering, their treads crushing both vegetation and the wounded who could not move. The systematic elimination was merciless. By late afternoon, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of Ichiki's assault force, nearly 800 men lay dead. Colonel Ichiki himself was among them, likely by his own hand after burning his regimental colors. Marine losses were 34 killed and 75 wounded. In a single bloody morning, the 1st Marine Division had not just won a battle, they had delivered a ratio of slaughter that turned the foundational belief of the Imperial Japanese Army into a catastrophic lie. When the first fractured reports of the Tenaru massacre reached Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, they were met not with alarm, but with incredulous denial. The concept that a full-strength, elite Japanese infantry battalion could be annihilated by American Marines was so incompatible with their worldview that senior officers dismissed it as impossible. The defeat had to be the result of a tactical fluke. Perhaps Ichiki had stumbled into a trap or bad luck, or had made a simple error in navigation. The core assumption remained sacrosanct. The American fighting spirit was still the weak link. Therefore, the solution was not to reconsider the enemy, but to redouble their own efforts. The failure was reframed as one of scale, not substance. The commander of the 17th Army, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, authorized a second, larger operation. This time, command fell to the more thoughtful Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a veteran of Borneo and the Philippines. He was given a formidable force, over 6,000 seasoned troops from the 35th Infantry Brigade. The plan evolved from Ichiki's brute force frontal assault into something more sophisticated. Kawaguchi would avoid the fortified coastal approaches altogether. Instead, his brigade would be landed far to the east and undertake a daring multi-day march through the island's treacherous southern jungle to strike Henderson Field from the undefended southern ridge, a strategy that leveraged Japanese endurance and tactical surprise. In the minds of the high command, the problem was solved. They had simply sent a boy to do a man's job. Now they were sending a samurai. General Kawaguchi, though more cerebral than the impetuous Ichiki, was still a product of the same system. He studied the Tenaru reports and understood the folly of attacking across open ground. His jungle flanking maneuver was tactically sound, even clever. Yet his underlying faith remained unshaken. Once his veterans broke into the Marine perimeter in a furious night assault, American morale would collapse. The spirit of Japan would yet prevail. What Kawaguchi and his planners fatally underestimated was not the Marine, but the island itself. The march through Guadalcanal's southern jungles became an epic of suffering that crippled the brigade before a single shot was fired. The terrain was a nightmare of sheer ravines, tangled roots, and swollen rivers. Coherent units dissolved into scattered, exhausted groups. Supply lines broke down. Men went days with only a handful of rice. Heavy weapons and artillery had to be abandoned. When Kawaguchi's emaciated, disorganized forces finally began to coalesce south of the airfield in early September, they faced not an undefended ridge, but a prepared position held by the Marine raiders and paratroopers under the fierce Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. Edson, sensing the threat, had fortified the unnamed grassy ridge that pointed like a knife toward Henderson Field. Kawaguchi, believing his mere presence behind American lines was a psychological victory, was unaware that his greatest enemy had not been the jungle, but the clock. It had given the Marines time to turn his point of intended surprise into their own fortress. The stage was set not for a triumphant Banzai, but for a desperate and bloody siege that would give the ridge its new permanent name. Exhausted, hungry, and with their coordination in tatters, General Kawaguchi's soldiers finally launched their assault on the night of September 12, 1942. They emerged from the jungle's black wall not as a cohesive wave, but in desperate, screaming clusters, throwing themselves against the Marine lines dug into the silent, grassy ridge. What they encountered was not panic, but a storm of disciplined fire. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, a hardened veteran of jungle warfare in Nicaragua, had transformed the ridge into a lethal killing zone. He had positioned his 800 raiders and parachutists, some of the toughest men in the Corps, in a series of mutually supporting strongpoints, with artillery pre-sighted on every possible approach. As Japanese flares and machine gun tracers lit the night in a ghastly strobe, the battle descended into chaos at point-blank range. The Marines held firm, fighting off repeated charges with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Positions were overrun, only to be retaken in furious counterattacks led by Edson himself, who moved along the crumbling line, shouting orders and steadying his men. The fighting was so intimate and brutal that at times it dissolved into a savage brawl of fists, knives, and entrenching tools in the dark. For 2 consecutive nights, the ridge shuddered under the weight of Kawaguchi's desperate attempts to break through, the air thick with the screams of the wounded and the relentless crack of sniper fire. The climax came on the second night, September 13th, when a determined Japanese penetration drove deep into the Marine perimeter, reaching a point barely 300 yards from the edge of Henderson Field itself. In the headquarters below, the situation was deemed so dire that orders were prepared to destroy the aircraft and fuel dumps to prevent their capture. The entire American foothold on Guadalcanal hung by a thread. It was here that Edson issued his legendary defiant command to his buckling troops. "There is only one place for us now. On this ridge, we will hold." And hold they did. The final Japanese surge broke against a wall of Marine resolve and precisely directed artillery fire that rained hell on the attackers. By dawn on September 14th, the sounds of battle were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the moans of the dying. The ridge, now forever known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, was held. Kawaguchi's brigade, having suffered over 600 killed and hundreds more wounded, streamed back into the jungle in defeat. The Marines counted their own heavy losses, but they had achieved the impossible once more. They had not only defeated a superior force in a prepared attack, but also shattered the last Japanese hope for a quick, decisive victory. General Vandegrift would later admit this was the campaign's most desperate hour. The Japanese High Command, however, absorbed this second catastrophe with the same dangerous logic as the first. They had simply not sent enough men. Stunned by the twin disasters at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge, the Imperial Japanese Army did not pause for introspection. It doubled down. Convinced that victory was merely a matter of mass, they initiated their most ambitious plan yet, the October counteroffensive. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake himself arrived on the island to command over 20,000 fresh troops, including the elite 2nd Sendai Division, veterans of Manchuria and famed for their night-fighting prowess. The plan was a complex, multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the marine perimeter from the south and west simultaneously, supported by heavy naval bombardment and air attacks. Confidence in Rabaul and Tokyo reached a fever pitch. Hyakutake's staff, so certain of success, drafted meticulous plans for the formal surrender of the American forces, debating the protocol for accepting General Vandegrift's sword. The date was set for October 23, 1942. This was to be the Kessen, the decisive battle that would end the Guadalcanal campaign in one glorious night. Yet as the massive Japanese force moved into position, a fatal rigidity settled over the operation. The plan was sacrosanct, initiative was stifled. When one battalion commander requested a 24-hour delay due to the treacherous jungle march, he was refused. The attack would proceed as scheduled, coordination be damned. This inflexibility would collide with a marine defense that had grown tougher, deeper, and led by men who knew how to adapt minute by minute. The October offensive unfolded as a series of brutal, disjointed actions. The main Sendai Division assault from the south, delayed and disorganized, finally hit the Marine lines on the night of October 25th. It focused with terrifying force on a sector held by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by the formidable Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller. Here, in a hellscape of mud, screaming metal, and shadows, the battle crystallized around a single machine gun section led by Sergeant John Basilone. As thousands of Japanese soldiers charged his position, Basilone's guns became the fulcrum of the defense. He fought for 2 days without rest, moving through enemy fire to resupply ammunition, clearing jammed weapons with burnt hands, and manning guns himself when his crew fell. The attacks were so relentless that the pile of enemy bodies eventually obstructed their field of fire. By the time reinforcements arrived, Basilone and 2 others were the only men standing in their sector, the ground before them a carpet of Sendai dead. The broader offensive failed everywhere with catastrophic losses. In the aftermath, a baffled Puller asked a captured Japanese officer why they hadn't exploited a weaker point in the line once the assault stalled. The prisoner's reply was a perfect epitaph for Japan's strategy on Guadalcanal. That is not the Japanese way. The plan was made. No one would change it. The last great push had broken, not for a lack of courage, but because the American defense proved as adaptable as the Japanese attack was rigid. The myth of Yamato Damashi was now buried under the bodies of its finest divisions.